In the suffocating heat of a Ugandan morning, 106 hostages sat trapped inside a crumbling airport terminal, their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads. They had no idea that thousands of miles away in Tel Aviv, a decision was being made that would either save them all or seal their fate forever. So audacious, so impossible, that even the planners themselves questioned whether they had lost their minds. This is the story of Operation Entebbe, the night Israel gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice. June 27, 1976. The world seemed balanced on a knife's edge, caught between the dying embers of one era and the violent birth of another. Terrorism had evolved from scattered acts of violence into a calculated weapon of psychological warfare. And nowhere was this more evident than in the gleaming terminals of international airports. Air travel, once a symbol of human progress and connection, had become a hunting ground for those who understood that fear travels faster than any jet engine. On that fateful morning, Air France Flight 139 sat on the tarmac at Ben Gurion Airport, its silver fuselage reflecting the harsh Israeli sun. Inside, 246 passengers settled into their seats, most of them Jewish families returning home after vacations or business trips. They carried with them the comfortable assumption that their journey to Paris would be nothing more than routine. A few hours of cramped seats and airline food before touching down safely in the city of light. None of them could have imagined that they were about to become pawns in a deadly game that would span continents and test the very limits of human courage. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing into the Mediterranean sky as passengers opened books, adjusted headphones, and settled in for what they believed would be an uneventful flight. The captain, Michel Bacos, was a seasoned pilot whose steady hands had guided countless flights across European skies. His crew moved efficiently through the cabin, serving drinks and checking seatbelts with the practiced ease of professionals who had performed these rituals thousands of times. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even, as the Boeing sliced through thin clouds toward its scheduled stop in Athens. But Athens would prove to be more than just a refueling stop. The Greek capital's airport had become notorious for its lax security, a fact well known to those who moved in the shadows of international terrorism. As passengers disembarked and new ones boarded, 4 individuals made their way onto Flight 139 with deadly precision. They appeared unremarkable, ordinary travelers carrying ordinary luggage, but hidden within their belongings were instruments of terror that would transform a routine commercial flight into an international crisis. Wilfried Böse and Brigitte Kuhlmann represented the new face of global terrorism. German radicals from the Baader-Meinhof group, who had allied themselves with Palestinian militants in a twisted marriage of revolutionary ideologies. Alongside them came 2 members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, their faces calm masks hiding the violence they were prepared to unleash. Together they embodied the nightmare that aviation security experts had long feared, the international terrorist network, bound not by nationality but by a shared willingness to spill innocent blood in pursuit of their cause. As the aircraft departed Athens and climbed toward its cruising altitude, these 4 individuals began their final preparations. They had studied every detail of their plan, rehearsed every movement, and steeled themselves for what was to come. In their minds, they were not hijackers, but soldiers in a righteous war, and the men, women, and children around them were not innocent passengers, but acceptable casualties in their struggle against what they saw as an oppressive system. 7 minutes out of Athens, the mask of normalcy was torn away forever. The German man burst into the cockpit with a pistol in his hand, pressing the cold metal against Captain Bacos's temple as his accomplices revealed hidden grenades and began shouting orders in multiple languages. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Peaceful passengers became hostages, their vacation plans replaced by the stark reality of mortal danger. Children began crying, mothers pulled their young ones close, and men who had served in multiple wars found themselves helpless against an enemy that hid among civilians. Captain Bacos, his military training from World War II suddenly relevant again, forced himself to remain calm as the terrorists' weapon stayed fixed on his skull. The hijackers' demands were simple but chilling. Change course immediately, head south toward Libya, and prepare for a journey that would take them far from any hope of rescue. The captain's hands moved across the controls with deliberate precision, knowing that a single wrong move could trigger a massacre 30,000 feet above the earth. Behind him in the passenger cabin, his crew faced the impossible task of maintaining order while armed terrorists sorted through passports with the methodical efficiency of judges pronouncing death sentences. What followed next would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The hijackers began separating passengers based on their names, their faces, their documentation. Jewish passengers were forced to one side of the aircraft, while others remained in their original seats. The selection process, conducted with bureaucratic coldness, evoked the darkest chapters of recent history. For many of the older passengers, the nightmare was not just about the immediate threat to their lives, but about the resurrection of horrors they thought the world had left behind forever. As the aircraft descended toward Benghazi for refueling, one passenger managed to turn terror into opportunity. A British-born Israeli woman named Patricia Martel, thinking with desperate clarity, began to feign a medical emergency. She cut herself deliberately, allowing blood to flow as she claimed to be suffering a miscarriage. Her performance was so convincing that even the hardened terrorists allowed her to be removed from the aircraft when it landed in Libya. What they could not have known was that they had just released someone who would become a crucial intelligence asset for the forces already beginning to mobilize thousands of miles away. The refueling stop in Libya was brief but significant. Libyan authorities, sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, provided fuel and supplies without question. More importantly for the hijackers, they received confirmation that their ultimate destination was prepared to welcome them. Uganda, under the brutal dictatorship of Idi Amin, had already agreed to provide safe haven for the operation. Amin, a megalomaniacal dictator who had decorated his uniform with medals he awarded himself, saw the hijacking as an opportunity to thrust himself onto the world stage while striking a blow against Israel, a nation he had come to despise. When the aircraft finally touched down at Entebbe Airport in the early hours of June 28th, the hostages found themselves in a place that seemed designed for despair. The old terminal building, abandoned when a newer facility was constructed, had been hastily converted into a prison. Its windows were boarded up, its facilities barely functional, and its isolation complete. Here, surrounded by Ugandan soldiers and additional Palestinian terrorists who had joined the operation, the hostages would spend the next week wondering if they would ever see their families again. But what the terrorists could not have anticipated was the response their actions would trigger in Jerusalem. Even as the hostages were being marched into their makeshift prison, Israeli intelligence networks were already beginning to gather information with the desperate efficiency of a nation that understood the stakes. The released passenger from Libya was being debriefed by intelligence officers who recorded every detail she could remember about the hijackers, their weapons, and their apparent plans. In the halls of Israeli power, an extraordinary debate was about to begin. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin stood before a room filled with the most powerful figures in Israeli government, his weathered face bearing the weight of an impossible decision. Around the table sat Defense Minister Shimon Peres, Chief of Staff Mordecai Gur, and intelligence chiefs whose names would never appear in public records. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as they grappled with a crisis that threatened to tear apart everything they had built since independence. In their hands lay the power to reshape history, but every option before them seemed to lead toward disaster. The hijackers' demands were as audacious as they were clear. They wanted 53 Palestinian militants released from Israeli prisons, along with 13 more from facilities in other countries. They demanded $5 million in ransom money, and they had given Israel until July 1st to comply, threatening to begin executing hostages if their terms were not met. The deadline hung over Jerusalem like a sword, each passing hour bringing them closer to an unthinkable choice between capitulating to terrorism and watching innocent civilians die on international television. Rabin, who had commanded Israeli forces during their greatest military triumph in 1967, now faced a challenge that made the Six-Day War seem simple by comparison. Military victory against conventional armies was one thing, But this situation defied every principle of warfare he had learned over decades of service. The enemy held Israeli citizens hostage thousands of miles away, protected by the sovereignty of a hostile nation and surrounded by soldiers loyal to one of Africa's most unpredictable dictators. Any military response would require crossing multiple international borders, violating the airspace of several nations, and conducting combat operations in a location where failure would mean not just tactical defeat, but national humiliation. Perez argued passionately for exploring military options, his civilian background perhaps making him more willing to contemplate risks that seasoned generals instinctively avoided. He understood that yielding to the hijackers would establish a precedent that would haunt Israel for generations. Every terrorist group in the world would see that Israel could be forced to negotiate, that enough pressure applied to innocent civilians could break even the most resolute government. The implications stretched far beyond the immediate crisis, threatening to transform Israel from a nation that never surrendered into one that could be blackmailed by anyone ruthless enough to target its people. But General Gur represented the voice of military realism, his calculations cold and precise. Entebbe Airport lay 2,500 miles from Israeli territory, requiring any rescue force to fly over hostile nations that would shoot down Israeli aircraft without hesitation. The logistics alone seemed insurmountable. How could they transport enough soldiers to overwhelm the hijackers and their Ugandan allies? How could they refuel their aircraft for the return journey? How could they extract over 100 hostages from a fortified position without triggering a massacre? Each question spawned a dozen more, creating a web of complexity that seemed to strangle any hope of military success. As the debates raged through the night, Israeli intelligence officers worked with desperate intensity to gather every scrap of information about the situation in Uganda. Mossad agents contacted Patricia Martel, the woman who had escaped the aircraft in Libya, and subjected her to hours of detailed questioning. Her descriptions of the hijackers' weapons, their apparent numbers, and their psychological state provided the first concrete intelligence about what Israeli forces would face if they attempted a rescue. Every detail she remembered was recorded, analyzed, and cross-referenced with other sources as intelligence professionals built a picture of the enemy from fragments of observation. Other sources began feeding information into the growing intelligence file. Construction companies that had built portions of Entebbe Airport were contacted for blueprints and structural details. Former Israeli advisors who had worked in Uganda before Amin expelled them provided insights into the country's military capabilities and the airport's layout. Even old home movies taken by tourists visiting Entebbe were collected and studied frame by frame, as analysts searched for any detail that might prove useful in planning an assault. The intelligence gathering operation became a race against time, with each piece of information potentially representing the difference between success and catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Uganda, the hostages were experiencing their own form of psychological warfare. Idi Amin himself arrived at the terminal with characteristic theatrical flair, his massive frame filling doorways as he surveyed his prisoners with the satisfaction of a collector examining prized acquisitions. He spoke to them in English, his voice carrying the cultured accent of his British military training. But his words were those of a madman drunk on his own power. He promised to negotiate for their release while simultaneously making clear that their fate rested entirely in his hands. The dictator's visits were exercises in calculated cruelty, designed to demonstrate his absolute control over the situation. He would arrive with fanfare, surrounded by heavily armed soldiers, and speak to the hostages as if he were their protector rather than their captor. He claimed to be working tirelessly for their freedom while making subtle threats about what might happen if negotiations failed. The psychological impact was devastating, as prisoners found themselves dependent on the mercy of a man whose brutality was already legendary throughout Africa. The separation of Jewish passengers from others had created an additional layer of terror that went beyond immediate physical danger. Families were torn apart based on nothing more than their names or their passports, with some members held as hostages while others were released to carry messages to the outside world. The selection process, conducted with methodical precision by terrorists who seemed to relish their power over life and death, created an atmosphere of helplessness that wore down even the strongest personalities among the captives. Captain Bakos and his crew had been offered their freedom along with the non-Jewish passengers, but they chose to remain with their charges. Their decision represented a form of heroism that transcended national boundaries, a refusal to abandon people under their care even when escape was possible. The captain told the hijackers that all passengers were his responsibility, and he would not leave them behind regardless of the personal cost. His crew followed his example, creating a small nucleus of professional competence and moral courage within the chaos of the terminal. As the hours stretched into days, the hostages developed their own coping mechanisms for surviving the psychological pressure. Some retreated into themselves, conserving emotional energy for whatever ordeal lay ahead. Others formed small groups, sharing food and water while trying to maintain some semblance of normal human interaction. Parents struggled to comfort children who could not understand why they were being held prisoner, while elderly passengers worried about medications and medical conditions that required regular treatment. The terrorists themselves seemed to operate with the confidence of people who believed their cause justified any means necessary to achieve it. They moved among the hostages with casual brutality, using their weapons as tools of intimidation while discussing their political grievances as if mass kidnapping were a reasonable form of protest. Their certainty was perhaps their greatest weapon, as it created an atmosphere in which resistance seemed not just dangerous but futile. Back in Jerusalem, the clock continued its relentless countdown toward the July 1st deadline. Intelligence reports suggested that the terrorists were serious about their threat to begin executing hostages, and psychological profiles of the group's leadership indicated they possessed both the capability and the willingness to carry out mass murder. The pressure on Israeli decision-makers intensified with each passing hour as they faced the knowledge that their choices would determine whether over 100 innocent people lived or died in the coming days. Through the labyrinthine corridors of Israeli military headquarters, a name began to circulate in hushed conversations among the highest echelons of command. Sayeret Matkal, the most secretive and elite unit in the Israeli Defense Forces, represented the kind of surgical precision that could theoretically accomplish the impossible. These were not ordinary soldiers, but specialists trained for operations that existed at the very edge of military possibility. Men who had spent years learning to operate in hostile territory with nothing but their training and their willingness to die for their mission. The unit's commander was a 30-year-old officer whose reputation preceded him through every briefing room and planning session. Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and physical courage that marked the finest military leaders of his generation. Born in New York, but raised in the unforgiving crucible of Israeli military culture, he had already distinguished himself in operations that would remain classified for decades. His men followed him with the kind of loyalty that could only be earned through shared danger and proven competence under fire. Netanyahu's personal life reflected the toll that such responsibility extracted from those who bore it. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of constant deployments and the emotional distance required for survival in his profession. Yet he had found solace with Bruria, a woman who understood that loving a man like him meant accepting that duty would always come before personal happiness. In quiet moments between operations, he would write letters filled with philosophical reflections on love and mortality, as if trying to capture something beautiful before it slipped away forever. The planning sessions for what would eventually become Operation Thunderbolt took place in underground facilities where maps covered every available wall surface, and intelligence officers worked around the clock to transform fragments of information into actionable intelligence. The challenge was staggering in its complexity. How do you transport enough soldiers across 2,500 miles of hostile territory to overwhelm an unknown number of enemies while ensuring the survival of over 100 hostages? How do you coordinate multiple aircraft, ground forces, and support elements with split-second timing when failure means international humiliation and mass casualties? The breakthrough came when intelligence officers discovered that an Israeli construction company had built portions of Entebbe Airport years earlier, before Amin's rise to power had severed diplomatic relations between the two nations. Buried in corporate archives were detailed blueprints of the terminal building, precise measurements that would allow Israeli forces to construct an exact replica for training purposes. The discovery transformed the mission from theoretical impossibility into dangerous but achievable reality. Military engineers worked with frantic intensity to construct a full-scale model of the Entebbe terminal at a secure facility in the Negev desert. Every doorway, every corridor, every potential hiding place was recreated with obsessive attention to detail. The mock-up became a stage where Israeli commandos would rehearse the deadliest performance of their lives, practicing their movements until muscle memory could guide them through the operation, even in complete darkness. They studied architectural drawings until they could navigate the building blindfolded, memorizing the location of every pillar and wall that might provide cover or concealment. The training regimen pushed the commandos beyond normal human endurance as they practiced storming the replica terminal under every conceivable condition. They rehearsed the operation in daylight and darkness, with smoke and without, while dealing with simulated casualties and equipment failures. Each run-through was timed to the second, with commanders identifying every flaw and inefficiency that might cost lives when the mission became reality. The soldiers understood that their preparation would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of every hostage waiting in that distant terminal. Meanwhile, Israeli pilots faced their own impossible challenge. Flying 4 massive C-130 transport aircraft across thousands of miles of hostile territory required navigation skills that pushed the boundaries of what was considered feasible. They would need to avoid radar detection by multiple nations, maintain radio silence for hours at a time, and arrive at Entebbe with enough fuel to complete the mission and return home. The mathematical calculations alone were staggering as flight planners worked to balance fuel loads, aircraft weight, and range requirements while accounting for variables that could change at any moment. The route they eventually selected was a masterpiece of tactical deception, threading between radar installations and international boundaries. With the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, they would fly south over the Red Sea at wave-top altitude to avoid Egyptian detection, then turn inland over Ethiopia and Somalia before approaching Uganda from the northeast. Every mile of the journey carried the risk of discovery and destruction, as a single radar operator or vigilant pilot could trigger an international incident that would destroy any hope of rescue. As the deadline approached with merciless inevitability, the psychological pressure on both planners and hostages reached breaking points. In Jerusalem, government officials found themselves caught between impossible choices, knowing that any decision they made would be scrutinized by history and judged by the families whose loved ones hung in the balance. The weight of command had never felt heavier as men who had spent their careers making life and death decisions faced a situation where every option seemed to lead toward tragedy. The terrorists in Uganda, meanwhile, had settled into a routine of psychological manipulation that kept their prisoners in a constant state of anxiety. They would announce developments in negotiations that might or might not be true, raise hopes with talk of possible releases, then crush those hopes with reminders of what would happen if their demands were not met. The hostages found themselves living in a twilight world where time seemed suspended, where each day brought them closer to either freedom or death, without any way to influence the outcome. Amin's increasingly erratic behavior added another layer of unpredictability to an already volatile situation. The dictator would arrive at the terminal with no warning, sometimes bringing gifts of food or medicine, other times delivering rambling speeches about international politics and his own importance in world affairs. His presence terrified the hostages, who understood that their lives depended on the whims of a man whose grip on reality seemed to weaken with each passing day. They could see in his eyes the dangerous combination of intelligence and madness that had already cost hundreds of thousands of Ugandan lives. The breakthrough in Israeli planning came when intelligence officers confirmed that Ugandan forces at Entebbe were not expecting any kind of rescue attempt. Amin's confidence in his position had bred a dangerous complacency among his soldiers, who treated their guard duties as routine assignments rather than critical security operations. This overconfidence would become a crucial weakness that Israeli planners intended to exploit, but it also raised the stakes exponentially. Surprise would be their greatest weapon. But once that surprise was lost, they would face the full might of Uganda's military with no possibility of reinforcement or retreat. The final intelligence briefings painted a picture of an operation balanced on the knife's edge between triumph and catastrophe. Success would require perfect execution of a plan with dozens of moving parts, each dependent on the others for survival. A single equipment failure, a moment's hesitation, or an unexpected change in enemy dispositions could transform rescue into massacre. Yet the alternative was surrender to terrorism. Acceptance that Israeli citizens could be kidnapped and murdered with impunity by anyone willing to cross moral boundaries that civilized nations respected. On July 3rd, as the sun set over Israel's Mediterranean coast, the moment of decision finally arrived. The emergency session of the Israeli cabinet convened in a room where the weight of history pressed down like a physical force. Prime Minister Rabin sat at the head of a polished table that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the wood as intelligence officers delivered their final assessments. The air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke, creating an atmosphere where every word carried the potential to alter the course of events. Around him sat the architects of modern Israel, men who had witnessed the birth of a nation and now faced the possibility of its greatest gamble. Defense Minister Peres leaned forward as he presented the military option with the passion of someone who understood that weakness invited aggression. His voice cut through the silence as he outlined the risks and possibilities, painting a picture of Israeli commandos striking deep into the heart of Africa to reclaim their people. The plan was audacious beyond any previous military operation, requiring coordination between multiple aircraft, precise timing, and flawless execution thousands of miles from home. Yet Peres argued that the alternative was worse than the risks they faced, that capitulation would mark Israel as a nation that could be broken through terror. General Gur represented the voice of military caution, his weathered features betraying none of the emotion that churned beneath his professional demeanor. He had commanded troops in multiple wars and understood better than most the gap between planning and reality, between theory and the chaos that erupted when bullets began flying. His objections were not born of cowardice, but of experience, the hard-earned knowledge that even the best soldiers could die when operations went wrong. He spoke of fuel calculations and radar coverage, of international airspace violations and diplomatic consequences that could isolate Israel from its allies. The intelligence briefing that followed was delivered by officers whose names would never appear in public records, men who had spent weeks assembling fragments of information into a coherent picture. They described the layout of Entebbe Airport with the precision of architects, detailing every building and runway that Israeli forces would encounter. They reported on Ugandan military strength, on the number of soldiers stationed at the airport, and on the psychological profiles of the hijackers themselves. Each piece of data was presented dispassionately, but everyone in the room understood that lives hung in the balance of every detail. The released hostage Patricia Martel had provided crucial intelligence through her debriefing sessions with Mossad agents. Her descriptions of the hijackers' weapons and behavior patterns, combined with her observations about the terminal's layout and security measures, had filled critical gaps in Israeli knowledge. She had memorized details with the clarity of someone who understood that her memories might be the key to saving lives, describing everything from the number of guards to the times when they changed shifts. Her courage in faking a medical emergency to escape had transformed her from victim into intelligence asset. At 1800 hours, the vote was called. Each cabinet member faced a choice that would define not just their own legacy, but the character of their nation. To approve the military option meant risking catastrophic failure on an international stage, the possibility that Israeli soldiers would die in Uganda while the world watched. To reject it meant accepting that terrorism could force Israel to its knees, that enough pressure applied to innocent civilians could break even the most resolute government. The decision required a leap of faith that went beyond normal political calculations. The vote was unanimous. Operation Thunderbolt was authorized. Operation Entebbe stands as more than a military victory. It was a declaration written in blood and courage that some lines can never be crossed. In 90 minutes of controlled violence, Israel proved that distance means nothing when principle is at stake, that no sanctuary exists for those who target the innocent. Yonatan Netanyahu's sacrifice illuminated a truth that echoes through history. Sometimes the price of freedom is measured not in negotiations or compromises, but in the willingness of extraordinary individuals to risk everything for those they've never met. The raid's success resonated far beyond the rescued hostages, sending an unmistakable message to terrorists worldwide that certain nations will pursue justice to the ends of the earth. In that abandoned terminal in Uganda, Israel didn't just save lives, it preserved the idea that evil actions carry consequences, that courage can triumph over terror when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things.